Go into my presentation here. So first of all, just two caveats for former students of mine. I was known as the caveat guy because that was my favorite word. So two quick caveats. First of all, this presentation is very much, or this paper really is very much a work in progress. So in that sense, it's a lot more like what we did last year, where there were works in various levels, various stages of development. This is definitely in the earlier stages of development, so apologies in advance for that. Secondly, because of that, I have 27 double-spaced pages here. I realized yesterday to read that word for word would take an hour, so we're not going to do that. So there are certain pages, so basically I'll kind of ping-pong back and forth between some portions I'm going to read word for word, and then other portions I'll just summarize. And then in some places here and there, I might even get to do some hand waving, do the G.E. Moore thing for those philosophers that go out there. Might even get to do a little bit of that. So, all right, so now what that is going to do. The title of my talk is called Disability, Suffering, and Hope. The recent much publicized case of Brittany Maynard surfaced important issues related to disability, suffering, and hope. Diagnosed with the most deadly form of brain cancer, informed that she had only months left to live, and facing the inevitable prospect of debilitating deterioration as a result of the disease and its treatment. Maynard chose to move to Oregon, where she could take advantage of the state's right to die or death with dignity laws in order to obtain what she called a death with dignity. So after setting a date on which she would commit suicide, she then embarked on a national public campaign for the right, the so-called right to assisted suicide, which she argued should be available in all 50 states. And then finally, on November 1st, 2014, at the age of 29, Brittany Maynard took her life. Now, contrast that with the experience of a young man named J.J. Hansen. Diagnosed on May 13, 2014, with the exact same condition, stage 4 glioblastoma multiforme, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so he was diagnosed with that, and he was told that there was no hope of recovery. But instead, Hansen sought out other expert opinions, and like a second and a third physician, until he finally found one who was willing to take aggressive action in treating his cancer, including enrolling him in a clinical trial. As of January 2016, nearly 2 years after his initial diagnosis, Hansen was in remission and had launched a national campaign against physician-assisted suicide. At the end of last year, at the end of 2015, he released a video on YouTube asking viewers to reach out with encouragement to those facing terminal illnesses. There are many people out there that feel scared and alone, he said. Let's give them what they need this holiday season. Let's give them hope. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, at the beginning of life, it's well known that the prognosis or diagnosis of a disabling condition is almost always received as negative, unwelcome news that can invite various actions intended to avoid that condition. In the prenatal context, this can include so-called selective termination, which for certain diagnoses, as I'm sure you all know, is employed at a very high frequency. So, for example, the British National Health Service reported that from the years 1989 to 1995, 92% of fetuses diagnosed with Down syndrome were aborted. More recently, statistics here in the United States show that some 60 to 90% of fetuses here in the United States that are diagnosed with Down syndrome are then subsequently aborted. So how do we account for these disparate attitudes toward and responses to the possibility or potential of disability? How to explain the overwhelming propensity to select lethally against fetuses diagnosed with a condition such as Down syndrome? What accounts for the differences between the Maynard and the Hansen cases? The radically opposed responses to nearly identical circumstances. I would submit that the explanation lies in competing narratives regarding the nature, purpose, and meaning of disability, suffering, and hope. Consider, for example, and by way of further contrast to the Brittany Maynard case, the recent experiences of J. Todd Billings and David Kuo. Over the course of his long, protracted battles with incurable cancer, J. Todd Billings has learned to, quote, lament, while yet maintaining hope in the midst of intense suffering. For Billings, genuine comfort has come in part from an understanding of the implications of the doctrine of the incarnation. As Billings says, in the incarnation, the Son assumes human suffering and death in order to conquer suffering and death, emptying them of their finality. We hope because in Christ, God has taken on human suffering and death, so that they are denied their power to define their lives. As of this writing, namely this month, J. Todd Billings is still fighting his battle with cancer. David Kuo, on the other hand, has now finished his race and finished it well. He too endured a long, painful battle with cancer. And like many in his circumstances, he and his family had the opportunity, if they so chose, to seek the option of physician-assisted suicide. Yet David, together with his wife Kim, came to the conclusion that to endorse assisted suicide is simply to give up hope. Why did they come to that conclusion? Because from their perspective, no matter what happens in our lives, God is sovereign. No one below the throne of God can predict how the journey of life will go, and we shouldn't pretend to, says Kim Kuo, now a widow. In the end, choosing suicide at any point is the same sin Adam and Eve committed in the garden, the pride of wanting to be God, not simply to serve him. Now, these divergent responses to the prospect of disability and or suffering bring into stark relief the concerns expressed by many people with disabilities today. Faced with an increasing societal acceptance of right to die and death with dignity policies, many disability advocates are worried that we are heading down the proverbial slippery slope, from voluntary physician-assisted suicide to involuntary and non-voluntary euthanasia, from the right to die to the duty to die. If we are to prevent a further slide down this slope, we need to recover and cultivate an alternative replacement narrative regarding disability, suffering, and hope. And Christian theology, I would suggest, provides just the sorts of resources that are necessary to develop such a narrative. To that end, I will argue in this paper that conceptually, disability, suffering, and hope all share a common structure. Namely, they involve an interaction between the individual and the surrounding society. To put it differently, each of these notions is grounded or embedded in a broader sociocultural context, one that extends beyond the individual who is experiencing disability and or suffering. Following on this and drawing on philosophical accounts of disability, suffering, and hope, as well as narrative theology, I will argue to the conclusion that disability and suffering do not preclude genuine hope, because both disability and suffering are capable of being integrated into a larger, meaningful narrative in which hope is grounded in the grace of the cross and the promise of the empty tomb. Okay, moving now into my first main section on disability. So moving first to a consideration of disability, it should be emphasized that the concept of disability is notoriously vague and slippery. Indeed, a voluminous literature has sprung up around the question of what is disability, and I've contributed to that voluminous literature with a 450-page dissertation. So, killed a few trees on that one. Even a cursory exploration of this literature would take us well beyond the scope of this present work, not to mention this session here. So for now, a stipulative account will have to suffice, one that accords with the direction in which recent scholarship has been trending, and that represents a more or less general consensus, at least current consensus in the usage of the term. So, for purposes of this paper, I will suggest that disability is best understood as involving a dynamic interaction between the individual with an impairment or other limiting condition and the environment, that is, physical, cultural, social, etc., in which she finds herself. Ultimately, disability involves a negative mismatch, if you will, between the individual and the demands of her surrounding environment, where the term environment is understood broadly. The important point, and again, one that would require much greater space and time than is available here to defend thoroughly, but the important point is that disability is not merely a condition, if you will, in the individual. It is not only a matter of impairment, defect, or other limitation in the individual deemed to be disabled. There is inevitably a social aspect to the phenomenon of disability, whatever else we might want to say about it. Now, as a relatively simple illustration of this point, consider the person with a mobility impairment that necessitates his use of a wheelchair. Wonder who I'm thinking of. Clearly, the extent to which he is limited will depend in part on the environment. Physical, built, arranged, that includes things like social structures and institutions and practices. It will depend on the environment in which he finds himself. Is he surrounded by steep hills or flat, open expanses? Do sidewalks and pedestrian walkways have curb cutouts? Are buildings easily accessible via wheelchair ramps? Or must one navigate stairways and other obstacles in order to gain entry? Are people with mobility impairments intentionally included in or excluded from the life of a social community, from the social life of the community? Are they considered cursed by the gods, denied voting privileges? Are community activities planned with their limitations in mind, or are they simply ignored, not thought of at all? So the point is just that there's a lot of external factors that interact with the individual to create a state of a state of affairs that we would call disabled. Now this is just one example, but the point should be clear. Regardless of how one defines disability in technical terms, as a practical matter at least, there is an ineluctably social dimension to the disability experience. And that is the important point for our purposes. People with disabilities do not experience disability in isolation from others. Instead, their disabilities are in part a function of their socio-cultural environment. The limiting effects of impairments on the daily lives of individuals with these conditions can be profoundly shaped by the ways in which their society interacts with them. Disability is, in a very real sense, a matter of the individual plus society. That's the disability part of it. Now, moving on to the next section. Here's where I'm going to start to summarize in the interest of time. The next section is on suffering. And the first thing to understand about suffering is to be a rather obvious distinction, but one that's important to make, and that's that suffering is not identical with pain. Pain and suffering are distinct. So you can have pain, particularly physical pain especially, without it being experienced as suffering, or you can have suffering even in the absence of pain. So I give a couple of examples in here. For example, routine dental work, you would probably typically would be identified as pain, but you wouldn't typically say you're suffering from routine dental work, unless it's a horrible dentist or something. So suffering, pain while they often go together, aren't anyway. That's the main point there. Just to keep, that's an important distinction to keep in mind. So if that's what suffering isn't, what is suffering? Well, here I follow, for purposes of this paper, I follow the now classic treatment of the subject advanced by Eric J. Cassell, who many of you, especially Dr. Somesi, will be familiar with. So Cassell identifies a number of key elements that define or key characteristics of suffering. First of all, suffering is personal. That is to say, it's experienced at the level of the person. Thanks. It's experienced at the level of the person. It's also unique to the individual. Your suffering is your suffering. I might be able to empathize and sympathize with you, but I can't literally feel your pain or literally feel your suffering, much as I might try to. So suffering is intensely personal. Secondly, suffering is triggered by a perceived threat to one's personal integrity. So again, it goes beyond just I'm in pain, but rather I feel a threat somehow to my personal integrity, to who I am as a person. And then following from those 2 points again is just to say that it goes beyond merely the physical. So it comes about when an impending destruction of the person is perceived. So at the most general level, Cassell concludes that suffering can be defined as the severe distress associated with events that threaten the intactness of persons. Now, persons, even on virtually any account of what it is to be a person, it's generally accepted that persons, at least phenomenologically, are multi-dimensional. That is to say, there's multiple aspects to at least persons experience themselves as having various aspects. Their mental lives, their physical lives, their social lives, a lot of spiritual lives, a lot of different aspects to who they are. Now, suffering can attack any one of those particular aspects. So that suggests that then suffering can be ameliorated in a number of different ways, namely by addressing whatever aspect of person is being, if you will, attacked, or is under some kind of threat. So that can include things like finding ways to grow in and through suffering, borrowing strength from other people. When you yourself feel weak and you feel weak, you feel like you don't have strength, you in a sense borrow other people's strength. And especially finding meaning, what Cassell referred to meaning and transcendence. So that's just a synopsis of Cassell's account of suffering. I could go into much greater detail. But again, the bottom line point here is the account that Cassell developed and that I'm adopting for purposes of this paper. Again, the notion that there's an intellectually social component to suffering. And you see that especially in the area of chronic illness and chronic pain. Chronic illness, for example, the chronically ill person may really struggle with not being able to meet the standards that society would normally place on that person, or the roles that that person would normally be required to function to perform in. And that can create, that itself, that failure to meet external requirements can itself be a source of suffering for the chronically ill person. The person who experiences chronic pain, similarly, often, I'm sorry, yeah, so the person who experiences chronic pain often has a similar set of issues, and one of the things that's interesting about pain is that especially the medical practitioners in the room here know, is that pain can have multiple pathways for manifestation and expression. And so the way Cassell puts it is, pain is modified by the person who's actually experiencing it. So the person, and the key point there is that the person attaches a certain kind of meaning to the pain experience, to pain that he or she is experiencing. And so really the key point here, and I'm summarizing a lot that goes on in the paper here, but really the key point with both the person who's chronically ill and the person who's experiencing chronic pain is that one of the key ways that they have to come to deal with the pain and the illness that they're dealing with is to learn to, if you will, to reinterpret or adopt, if you will, a replacement narrative about the meaning of their illness and their pain. So we can return to that in the discussion as needed. But the point here, the crucial thing to note about the pain process as well as the illness, dealing with chronic pain, is that the progression from pain to suffering is that the seminal or the beginning point of that is the assignment of meaning. So the pain process begins with the assignment of meaning, and then various aspects of meaning shape the progression from pain to suffering in critical ways. So therefore, if we are to address issues of pain and suffering adequately, we must address issues of meaning and interpretation. Or to put it differently, we must think about the contours of the narrative in terms of which we understand pain and suffering. So for Cassell, addressing problems of meaning and hope can quite literally alter the hard medical facts of the case, as he puts it. And I want to suggest that something similar is true more generally of our understanding of disability, suffering, and their relationship to one another. only by, if you will, changing the facts of the case, adopting a replacement narrative, or at least only by changing the facts of the case, or at least how we view them, can we then find the path to genuine hope in the face of disability and suffering. So now at this point, before moving on, I just want to emphasize, just to be very clear here, that there's a distinction between disability and suffering. The disability is just that pain and suffering are not identical, also disability and suffering are not identical. They often go together. One is often the trigger for another, but neither is necessary nor sufficient for the other. You can have one without the other. So that's an important clarification there before moving on. Okay, so some theological and philosophical reflections on suffering and disability. So for people who are experiencing some form of either disability or suffering or both, typically the most important question that they wrestle with is not going to be, probably not going to be the theoretical, really complex theoretical questions about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering and philosophical theology at a very high abstract level. More likely, they're going to be struggling with, how do I make sense of this pain, this suffering, this disability in my life? What's this all about? So that's what I'm going to focus in on here. And so in what follows, in the time that remains, which is not much, I think, in what follows, we shall focus our attention specifically on disability and how it can be incorporated positively into the narrative or story of one's life. To get at the answer to that question, however, we first need to embark on what may initially appear to be an unrelated discursus into a consideration of the notions of theology of calling and related concepts derived from the resources of narrative theology. Now, in a paper titled Disability, Calling, and a Kind of Life Imposed on Man, philosopher Rick Langer draws on the writings of theologians such as William Perkins and Kevin Van Hooser, among others, to argue that rather than being an obstacle or a barrier to the pursuit of one's calling in life, it's possible and even quite natural, I'm quoting now, even quite natural to see one's disability as compatible, contributing, and at times even constitutive of one's calling. Now, the way he develops this argument, first of all, he says, okay, let's first try to understand what this notion of calling is. When we talk about calling, what do we mean? In contrast, the contemporary notion of what people often understand callings to be, things that you seek, you look for, you try to find, you discover, with an earlier notion of calling, and he draws from the 16th, draws particularly from William Perkins, Puritan theologian, who defined calling or vocation as a certain kind of life ordained and imposed on man by God for the common good. So he contrasts these two different notions of calling or vocation and said we need to get clear on what it means to have a calling. And bottom line of that is Langer argues to this point. He says callings just are impositions. That is to say, essential to the notion of a calling is that it comes as an imposition. It comes as something from external to the individual and it's imposed on the individual. That is to say, it's something that is answered. So in the sense, for example, a calling from God is a calling that one receives and answers. So Langer said, callings just are impositions. And therefore, even if disabilities are in some sense an imposition, that does not make them incompatible with one's calling. Now, there's a lot more here that unfortunately I'm probably going to have to skip over. But as I say, Langer contrasts that notion of calling with the typical contemporary notions of calling. And then he identifies several elements of calling. He said calling is not chosen, on the conception that he's advancing. Calling is not chosen, both for logical and theological reasons. It's not understood at the individual level. That is to say, you can't understand calling only in terms of the individual. And also callings, inevitably, or at least Christian callings, from the standpoint of Christian theology, callings are to service, that is, to serve the good of others. Okay. Now, so with that notion of calling in mind, then Langer goes on, and here I'm really skating over the surface here because I'm running out of time. But then he goes on to ask the question, if calling essentially is an imposition in some sense, that he explores in much greater detail in his paper, our calling, when it comes to disability, our disability is just merely negative impositions. That is to say, they foreclose opportunities. And that's all we can really say about disabilities as callings. So, for example, because I have a disability, I can't climb Mount Everest. Therefore, my calling must not be to climb Mount Everest, and that's all there is, end of the story. Or can disability be understood positively as actually generating a calling on one's life? And as you might guess by now, his answer to that question is yes. And in order to develop that idea, he draws on researchers from narrative theology, particularly Kevin Van Hooser's idea or concept of theology as a theodrama, where he draws an analogy between theology and improvisational improvisational theater, where, in a sense, we as believers are in a sense acting out a script, where that God comes to us, that circumstances come to us as offerings, to use the language of improvisational theater, to which we respond either by accepting the offering or rejecting it, or blocking it, actually, is the term that he uses. So with that as a background, then he goes on to argue, we can think it's useful and helpful to think about disabilities in a similar kind of way. Disabilities come to us as a kind of offering, as something that God offers to us in a certain sense, that we can then decide how we're going to respond to that. Am I going to accept that or reject it? Am I going to, that is to say, in the terms of, again, that's even the language of improvisational theater, but am I going to, so am I going to accept or block? Now, as he explains, to accept it means to narrate it into the story of one's life, to allow it to have a place and a purpose and meaning in one's life. So now, connecting all of that, that's the theoretical background. So essentially, the question then becomes, the bottom line question really becomes, the fundamental question which our discussion has been leading up to this point is, can Christian theology and the Christian worldview, on the Christian worldview, can disability actually be narrated, if you will, into the story of our lives, both individually and in terms of God's broader redemption plan? And here, toward the end of the paper, I suggest that the answer to that question is yes. That as you look at the biblical witness, both suffering and disability are front and center. Again, from Genesis to Revelation, both suffering and disability are front and center. They play deeply meaningful parts. They become very deeply meaningful in the work and activity that God is doing in this world. And I expand upon that. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time. But in my paper, I expand upon that. So finally, then the question in the final section, I talk about what hope is not, and then, if basically the structure of my argument from that point onward is, if indeed we can narrate disability into the story of our lives, that then provides the possibility for genuine hope. And then I talk in the final section about what hope isn't, what hope is, and I'll just close one, basically the bottom line definition, if you will, for purposes of the paper that I give. For the Christian, true hope is not wishful thinking like a game of luck. It is a confident expectation rooted in God's promises. And then I elaborate a little bit on what generates that confident expectation. So final bottom line conclusion, in the end, disability and suffering do not preclude genuine hope, because both disability and suffering are capable of being integrated into a larger, meaningful narrative. That's really the bottom line. So my apologies for having to skip over, do the 40,000, but hopefully you got the gist of it, and I'll be happy, we'll be, happy to go into more detail in the Q&A.
I want to commend Chris for a very wonderful paper, and I'm looking forward to when you all get to see it, and the incredible amount of thoughtful and thought-provoking material that's in it. I'm sorry that you didn't have as much time to particularly continue the elaboration on the question of calling and disability. Because that was the most moving part, the most stimulating part of the article from my perspective. My comments may seem a bit fragmented because there is a lot here to play with, and Chris has stimulated me to try to put some things together in a connection that I hadn't quite made before. And so my thoughts are very extemporaneous in regard, and I apologize for that in advance. Before I go any further, I do want to say how much I appreciate each one of you, and what a wonderful conversation this has been the past few days. It reminds me so much of how bioethics is necessarily a community, as a project, and how much, I as a clinician really depend upon and value the thoughts of the philosophers and theologians and all the things that you bring. So I thank you for that. And I also have to say that hope is a wonderful topic for me, given the fact that I named my second daughter Hope, based upon Jeremiah 29:11. One of the things that strikes me very impressively about the idea of calling is, we have to reflect upon some very difficult passages in Scripture. I think of Deuteronomy 32:39, when the Lord says, "And there is no God beside me, I kill and I make alive, I wound and I heal. And there is none that can deliver out of my hand." And though God is not the author of evil, we certainly know that evil is a part of his sovereign plan for things. And that's where the role of calling, particularly in terms of disability, I think becomes very important. My family, my wife is disabled, my two sons have intellectual disabilities, and as I'm about to share with you, I have come to understand in this last year the extent to which, and we all share a very deep brokenness that comes back to this definition of disability of not so much the medical individual model, but the social model. The impairments that afflict us all in being able to function as we were designed to function in community. You may not know, but I had to have a relatively urgent second aortic valve replacement this past summer due to a rapid restenosis of my bioprosthesis. And as I was getting ready for surgery, I was reflecting on the question that Bill had posed to us earlier about which is more important, the brain, the heart, or the blood. Of course it's the blood. But anyway, how could I be a hematologist and not claim that? But it caused me to reflect upon what was happening to me physically in terms of the lack of perfusion, the hunger of my organs, the constant atypical angina that I was having, the lightheadedness, and the profound weakness that I was experiencing because the blood wasn't perfusing to my brain. and to the rest of my body. But I got to thinking about heart as we often use it, which is not just that muscular pump, but as the core of who we are, our spiritual nature, our emotional nature. And I began to reflect on stenosis of that heart. And, reflecting on some very difficult events of the preceding several years, I began to understand how things like pride and anger and unforgiveness and self-loathing and all number of other unvirtuous feelings and dispositions that we would call sin can stenose the flow of the Holy Spirit in our lives and lead us to dysfunction. And so in this sense, I do want to look at disability in a very global sense. It is not to diminish in any way the severity and importance of physical disability, of intellectual disability. But what I'm trying to see through this idea of calling, coupled with Cassell's understanding of suffering as it's experienced, I began to see this concept that, if you will, we all are indeed disabled, but we tend to focus on individuals who may not have certain physical or demonstrable species-typical norms, while inside each of us is a corruption and a dysfunction, a stenosis of our hearts. And the calling that those in the disability community have for the rest of us is that they remind us, they focus us to see the reality of our being. We try very hard to deny our own brokenness, our own spiritual disability, our own emotional disability. And we say, oh, I'm just fine. And we deny sin. But what disability in our presence, in our community, in our fellowship forces all of us to do is to acknowledge that we are indeed all broken. We don't like that, however. We resist truth in every way we can. And so, looking at it from a history of bioethics, history of disability perspective, we can see that when society, with its beliefs that human beings will create utopia, that we will bring in, the new perfect world, whatever the totalitarian temptation may be. We have all sorts of labels and names, but they're all the same in this regard. And that is that we react to the reality of brokenness. We react to the reality that we cannot bring about utopia by trying, if anything, to prevent or kill the disabled in our midst. And I think about, here in Chicago, the ugly laws of the beginning of the 20th century. I think about the whole eugenics movement in the United States and around the world. I think of our own Supreme Court Justice saying in Buck versus Bell that the undesirables were sapping the strength of the state. And so what were we to do? We were to destroy them. We were to kill them, to murder them, to prevent them from coming into being. And what an amazing difference it is that we have, not dependent upon earthly hope, but dependent upon real hope. The hope in Christ, the hope in the eschaton. Hope is the seed in our hearts, but it requires a proper gardener to soak the seed in the waters of baptism. It needs to break the shell of the hard coat when needed, and to plant it in the soil of redemption, and to grow it in the warmth and the light of the Holy Spirit. That's genuine hope. And because of that, I think the brokenness that we can see is a blessing, because it does require us to reflect on the brokenness within. And so I'll just conclude by saying that we must cherish the disabled, and we must find hope in and with their individual stories, those narratives that can matter, because the journey from dysfunction to function is, and by Jesus, our shared destiny. And that, dear friends, is the true narrative of hope.